Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Depot Dive. We're going to dive into the three biggest Steelers-related topics of the week, and there are some big ones today. I am Ross McCormick, your host, and above me here on the screen, Joe Clark, as always, my co-host. Joe, how are you doing today?
Good. Good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. We are, 7 days now from actual meaningful football on Thursday night. Who's that between? It's the Chiefs and the Ravens, I believe, on
Yep.
Thursday night. And then on Friday night, you got the Eagles and is it the Browns? The Packers? I can't remember.
I think it's Packers Eagles, I want to say.
So, yeah, we're just very, very close to, the actual exciting part of the calendar. And the Steelers will obviously be kicking off their season on Sunday out on the road against the Atlanta Falcons. That should be a pretty intriguing matchup. We'll discuss that matchup a little more at length on next week's episode during the actual game week when we have, Tomlin Tuesday, and I guess now it's Russell Wilson Wednesday instead of Wednesday or Pickett Wednesday or whatever they had. So we're going to have a lot more of that talk next week. But this week we have some pretty big news with the 53-man roster reveal. There's some injury stuff, and obviously the quarterback was named Russell Wilson, the starter. We will talk about all that. Before we dive into our topics today, I just wanted to point towards the bottom of the screen if you guys are watching and not just listening on audio. The phone number, 412-254-3145. You can give us a call, ask us a question for a chance to have your question answered on a future episode. We're going to dive into our topics, the 53-man roster being the first one. Joe, do you have some just kind of high-level takeaways from the 53-man roster reveal?
Yeah, I think the biggest surprise that kind of everybody kind of agreed on was Jalen Elliott making the roster, with the second biggest surprise being the team keeping Logan Lee along the defensive line, six-round pick. He showed some versatility in camp, and he was able to play nose tackle too a little bit in the preseason, and like he was one of those guys that kind of did a little bit of everything. He was even taking snaps during training camp. But him making the roster was a huge surprise, especially because he didn't really pop in any of the two preseason games that he played in. He missed the third preseason game, an undisclosed injury. So a little bit surprising that they kept him. And I think, given the delay of Pittsburgh, it's now 3 o'clock on Thursday. They still haven't announced their practice squad. Um, didn't make any waiver claims. I wouldn't be surprised if we see, a little bit of reshuffling in the coming days with some of these bottom of the roster guys, but we'll see. It was, I think, Elliott making the roster was mostly because of his special teams ability, because he didn't really look all that good. He had some missed tackles, got blown off the ball a few times in the preseason, and obviously he was cut earlier in training camp, then brought back later. So surprising that when he wasn't on the 90-man roster, that now he's on the 53. And then obviously I think Beanie Bishop being the lone slot corner. Not a surprise that there's only one slot corner, just Bishop didn't really, grab hold of the job towards the end of camp, and it was kind of a battle with him and Thomas Graham. And I still think that's an area where you might see the team go outside the organization. But for now, Bishop will be the starting slot in, week one in Atlanta. So some interesting things there. I think Elliott and Lee were kind of the two big surprises for me, but there wasn't really anybody that got cut outside of maybe Des Fitzpatrick that, really surprised me in any big way.
Yeah, I would agree in terms of the people who were cut not being all that surprising. The Beanie Bishop Jr. situation, I mean, Thomas Graham not being on the roster, him being basically the only option. I mean, you have Deshaun Elliott who can play in the slot and did a little bit throughout training camp. But, Mike Tomlin spent the whole offseason pretty much tearing Beanie Bishop down in front of the media, and now he is the guy on the roster. And so that's definitely a funny kind of thing. I think when Beanie Bishop was asked about Tomlin saying, he hasn't shown enough or absolutely not or whatever specific phrasing he said, Bishop was basically like, that's just how Tomlin operates. And so I think there's a little bit of that, a little bit of Tomlin, what he's saying being true. I think it is true. The undrafted player who was injured and didn't participate, throughout the entire camp. He missed the second preseason game. He didn't practice leading up to the third preseason game very much. And so I think there's kind of truth on both sides. I think, Bishop, they are kind of viewing him as somebody who can contribute, but at the same time, I don't know that they're all that thrilled with that being their depth chart right now. So I agree they will be adding somebody We will see who that is. I know Alex Kozora's put out a list of some players around the league who are available after cut downs. A couple of those players have signed elsewhere. I know like Ugo Amadi was one of the guys that he listed. He's since signed to the practice squad. I can't remember which team, but yeah, so there's going to be probably some moves in the coming days. It's been a little bit slow ever since the 53-man roster was revealed. For me, a couple of the other takeaways that I had, Ryan McCollum, the backup center right now. The Steelers kind of opted for his experience. It's not a ton of experience, but it is, you can add together Spencer Anderson's center experience both in college and in the NFL, and obviously Mason McCormick not having any center experience in the NFL yet, besides he had 9 snaps in the preseason finale or something like that. Yeah, so they're opting for McCollum's experience, and I kind of thought he would be at risk for bouncing off the roster shortly after he made the 53, but now that Isaac Seumalo's hurt, and we'll talk about that in a bit, but now that he's hurt, it kind of seems more likely that McCollum might stick for a little bit, unless they do kind of bring in outside veteran help. But yeah, McCollum, pretty fun story. He was a waiver claim, I believe, from the Detroit Lions in 2022. The Steelers claimed him. He spent most of that season on the practice squad. I believe they released him for a week or two here and there. He spent 2023 on the practice squad. And now he's, made the 53-man roster as the backup center. And I think at least right now, as things stand, he has a decent chance of sticking around for a little bit. So, yeah, that one was interesting to me. They only kept 3 outside linebackers. Obviously, they were initially probably planning to keep 4 when they had Marcus Golden. He retired on them, and now they are kind of figuring to roll with DeMarvin Leal as kind of a defensive end / outside linebacker. He practiced that way in the final week or 2 of camp, and I think he played some of those snaps in the preseason games, and so that obviously freed up a spot elsewhere on the roster, his versatility, but I think his rookie season he played a little bit of outside linebacker. His second year he didn't play as much outside linebacker. They kind of had him focused elsewhere, and there was some question of what is the actual plan for him, and now it just kind of seems the plan is for him to wear both hats, which, we'll see how that goes, but he has had an impressive offseason compared to his past couple. So optimistic there, I guess, for now. But they placed on IR designated to return Jeremiah Moon. So at some point during the season, at least for 4 games, he'll be on IR, but he can return after that point. So we'll see what happens after then, but it seems like they will have a 4th outside linebacker at some point during the season. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't have designated him to return. So, Joe, are there any other takeaways from the 53-man roster that you found interesting? The wide receiver room, did you see Scotty Miller making it over Quez Watkins? Did you expect them to keep just 5? I think, that's a little less than they typically keep. Where are you at there?
I kind of thought they would keep 6. I thought Des Fitzpatrick kind of showed enough in preseason to kind of warrant a roster spot. And I'm not surprised Quez Watkins got caught. I think Scotty Miller showed a little bit more in the preseason. Watkins obviously had the mistakes on special teams. It's not going to help your chances of making the roster. So wasn't surprised to see Scotty make it, but I was surprised I didn't keep 6, especially with the state of Roman Wilson. He said yesterday that he's unsure he's going to be able to practice on Monday. If he's not practicing on Monday, who knows how much he's going to practice next week. Then that throws his availability for week 1 up in the air. Then you only have, 4 healthy receivers as it stands. But what you do know of the practice squad is they signed Brandon Johnson. He was in Denver the last 2 years. He's worked with Zach Azzani. He's worked with Russell Wilson. So, if Wilson does have to miss time earlier in the season, then I guess, Johnson's a guy that they could elevate off the practice squad. And who knows, maybe, Des Fitzpatrick wouldn't be surprised if he circles back to the practice squad. But yeah, I guess the fact that they only kept 5 was a little bit surprising because I did think Fitzpatrick probably deserved, a 6th spot and maybe a 6th wide receiver instead of Logan Lee was their 8th defensive lineman they kept, which is more than they usually do. So that was, just kind of how it all shakes out with, keeping 1 less receiver. You can keep 1 more lineman, but I was surprised by the way they kind of constructed their roster. But all in all, nothing really too crazy there. And it'll be interesting to see kind of how things within the next week or the next few days, as they fill out the bottom of the roster, what veterans they bring in, and how they fill out their practice squad if they go more developmental guys or have some guys that could be ready to step in, maybe as soon as week 1 if needed.
Yeah, and they kept 4 tight ends. The Steelers, the last 2 years, had only kept 3 tight ends, and so kind of seeing the influence of Arthur Smith's offensive system on the 53-man roster, keeping his guy Michael Pruitt, who he's worked with in the past. I had kind of had been leaning towards Rodney Williams making it over him, just because you if you're going to have 4, you kind of want those guys to be able to play special teams. Connor Hayward will definitely be playing some special teams. I don't know how much Michael Pruitt will be playing special teams as a 32-year-old, probably a little bit, but not as much as Rodney Williams could have offered. And so, I was kind of a little surprised by that, but I suppose I just underrated Pruitt's experience with Smith and kind of the value in that. And so I guess I shouldn't have been surprised in the end, but was just a little bit. I think that's all of my takeaways here for the 53-man roster. So we'll move on to our next topic here. Isaac Seumalo, yesterday after practice, it was reported by Adam Schefter that Seumalo had unfortunately suffered a pec injury that forced him to leave practice. He was going to be evaluated to see how long he'd be out. Not only like an hour later or an hour and a half later, Schefter followed up and said, they dodged a bullet. It's not expected to be a season ender, which is great news. But we're talking about probably, 4, 6, 7 kind of weeks. Maybe, we're talking about around the bye is when he starts practicing again, depending. I mean, I know who was it that reported 4 weeks? Was that
Mike Garafolo?
Yeah, Garafolo says 4 weeks. I know our Melanie Friedlander said that those minor pecs can kind of run a little, 4 to 6 kind of range, or even a little longer. She's got an excellent article up on the site that breaks down, in great detail the medical stuff behind these kinds of injuries. Obviously doesn't have all the information of what the injury was, but she is a surgeon, has a wealth of knowledge in that area. So I definitely recommend you guys go check out Dr. Melanie Friedlander's article on that posted this morning. But yeah, I mean, now we're talking about an offensive line that has, no matter who you start at tackle, whether it's Dan Moore, whether it's the Broderick Jones on the left and Troy Fautano on the right, no matter what configuration you have at tackle, you're looking at 4 of the 5 offensive linemen being 25 or younger, and James Daniels is a veteran, but he's only 26. So you're talking about probably one of the youngest offensive lines in the league. Joe, what are your takeaways with this whole situation with Isaac Seumalo?
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough timing right before the season, especially because he's a guy that the team didn't really work all that much in training camp. He got a lot of veteran days off. I think he had, 5 or 6 throughout the course of training camp. So he was somebody that the team really tried to protect. And now here we are, a week and a half before the season. He suffers a pec injury, but it is good that it wasn't, obviously it's good that it wasn't as serious. Torn pec could have knocked him out for the season, and then the Steelers are stuck starting, maybe a Mason McCormick or Spencer Anderson at that spot all year. So, hey, I'll miss a month. He'll be back probably. I think Dr. Mel said in her article that week 4 against the Colts is a good target return date. So, all things considered, could be worse, but missing games against, would be the Falcons, the Broncos, and the Chargers. It's not terrible. But the early portion of the season, as we've talked about, is very important for the Steelers to get off to a good start, given how difficult it is late in the year. And not having your most talented offensive lineman does make that a little bit more difficult, especially, with a team that wants to run the ball and a quarterback in Russell Wilson, who his biggest issue at this stage in his career is his penchant for taking sacks. So, not ideal. It's definitely, not a good thing, but I think after the initial report yesterday, everybody kind of breathed a sigh of relief that it wasn't as bad as initially, thought that it could have been. I remember when TJ Watt was the same thing week 1, 2 years ago when he tore his pec, they initially said there's fears he could be out for the season, and then it was partially torn and he was back a little bit later. I think he missed 7 games, and Dr. Mel said that was a worse injury than what Seumalo has. So, he should be back, within the first quarter, or at least the early portion of the season. So all in all, crisis kind of averted there, and hopefully, either Anderson or McCormick can fill in well in these, first 3 or 4 games.
Yeah, I think the plan with the offensive line and why having, three very young guys playing worked was because no matter what you had, you were going to have a veteran at right guard, you were going to have a veteran at left guard. And so, if they're in the huddle or if they're lined up and they need a little bit of guidance from a veteran, they had it right next to them no matter what you were doing with the configuration. Now that left side of the offensive line is going to be young no matter what way you cut it, at least for the first handful of games, 3, 4, 5 games of the season. We will see. But where do you lean in terms of Mason McCormick versus Spencer Anderson?
I would probably favor McCormick just because I'm kind of intrigued to see, what he can bring to the table. I think the foregone conclusion at this point is that James Daniels, this is his last season with the Steelers, so he'll hit the market and probably get a pretty, sizable contract from somewhere else next offseason. And the thought, at least with what was presented when they drafted McCormick, was he's somebody that could step in after a year when Daniels leaves, and then McCormick all of a sudden, hey, inserts himself as your starting right guard. So now, I mean, it's a good opportunity for him to play early. He's been, pretty steady in the preseason. He hasn't had any, glaring issues, at least that I've seen on tape. Even his center snaps, he was going up against like fourth stringers, so kind of hard to really glean too much from it. But he was solid. He was he did his job, and I think that's kind of what I saw from him in his college shape. Is he's just a guy that does his job. And I'm excited. I mean, I would lean. I think he probably offers you a little bit more upside than Anderson at this point. But Anderson did work ahead of McCormick on training camp when Seumalo would get his rest days, so I could see them going either way. I think Anderson did flash a little bit, during training camp last year and the preseason, and wasn't terrible this year. I think he kind of caught some of the blame for the botch fumble or the botch snap from Zach Frazier and Justin Fields because he was in charge of the silent count, and Zach Frazier didn't hear the change of protection. He wasn't thinking about the silent count. He tapped Frazier, snap goes haywire, and that's kind of what you're talking about with the lack of experience. And I think that's, that could have been the same deal with McCormick in there too. And that's why not having a veteran at that position could, be problematic, especially, you're looking at week 2 in Denver, and nothing more than those Denver fans would love than to see Russell Wilson fail. Mm-hmm. So having a rookie on that offensive line when you're probably gonna have to go silent count could be problematic. But I'm good either way. I would probably lean towards McCormick just because I think he's got more of a long-term future, but not going to really have too much of an issue whatever decision Mike Tomlin decides to go.
Yeah, I think I agree. I lean towards McCormick. I think from all the reports of training camp, the Steelers were pretty pleased with his ability to transition from FCS to the NFL. They were, I think, one report suggested they were surprised by how well he moved. They knew he moved well. He tested well at by all metrics, but even beyond what they expected, he was moving well. And I think that was one of the concerns, was just some of the kind of rough footwork that he had coming out of college. I think he mentioned something about having a neck brace that kind of limited his movement in college, and he's not wearing that anymore. And so I agree. I think Mason McCormick probably presents more upside. I would like to see what he has. But if the status quo is Anderson was coming off the bench first, then I would not be surprised at all if Anderson is kind of the week 1 guy, and we'll see what happens from there. I think I really do think the Steelers would not mind seeing Mason McCormick suit up, but it is a little scary to have potentially 3 rookies on the offensive line. It is also funny that just a week ago we were talking about who's the backup center, and the top 2 names were now the top 2 candidates to be the starting guard. So that obviously creates issues. The interior of the offensive line is lacking depth. I think this is kind of one of the reasons why McCollum stuck and why he might have a chance of sticking for a little bit longer. So we will see there. Moving on to our third and final topic of the show. Mike Tomlin, the much anticipated, or the national media at least made it up to be a big anticipated event. Mike Tomlin named Russell Wilson the starting quarterback of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He said it was a difficult decision. He said he was kind of surprised by how, athletic and how good both of the quarterbacks were. There's been some reports, I think Diana Rossini today said something along the lines of, Fields did have a opportunity to win the competition at various points throughout training camp. I think there is an upcoming interview with Arthur Smith on her podcast, Scoop City, and maybe even Mike Tomlin. She teased earlier a few weeks ago that Tomlin would be on there. And so I think she asked about that. Hopefully we get more information about that. But it does seem like maybe Fields maybe did have an opportunity at some point, at least according to her and what she gathered from her visit to the Steelers practice. I've kind of been on the Russell Wilson's going to be the starter almost no matter what train the whole time. But I think the way that everything played out with Russell's injury and everything, it did make it way more interesting than anybody thought that it would be. If Russell hadn't gotten injured, I don't know if there would have been much of a national media conversation about this. They wouldn't have had much to back their claims, regardless there. So, Joe, Russell's named the starter. What is this? Were you on the same page as me? Just this being expected?
Yeah, unlike some of our, oh so talented beat reporters who flipped their mind after the second preseason game and decided it was a competition, and then after the third said, yeah, never mind, it's not actually a competition anymore. Forget everything we said last week. I never really thought it was any sort of true competition. As soon as, Russell Wilson, as Mike Tomlin put Russell Wilson in pole position, it kind of seemed clear that he was going to be the starter. And I mean, if you go back to when they acquired Wilson, the whole plan was he was going to be ahead of Kenny Pickett. And I mean, Jerry Dulac said this on Twitter the other day, and then Kenny Pickett threw a hissy fit, and then they acquired Justin Fields. So it wasn't as if, their plans with Russell Wilson coming in and at least, having the first crack at being the starter changed with acquiring Fields, even though, he's better than Kenny Pickett. So I don't really think any of that was up in the air, and Wilson kind of did what he had to do. I think the injury made it, I guess a little bit more of an open competition, but I don't ever think it was really in doubt unless Wilson really struggled or, came back from the injury and like it had really hindered him and it somehow wasn't the same player. So yeah, I think it was just kind of a matter of time for the announcement to be made official. I don't think, Wilson it's a super secure job. I don't think he's on like some super long leash. And I think if he struggles early, the team, could turn to Fields after, I don't know, but let's say around the bye week. It wouldn't be a total surprise, I guess. So I wouldn't say that, Wilson has a stranglehold on the job, but I think him being the starter week one and getting the first crack to kind of hold the job and, lead the Steelers to the playoffs, which is, what TJ Watt and Cameron Hayward and Minkah Fitzpatrick all pitched him on doing. I think it's not a surprise at all. And I'm glad it's over with now and we can stop listening to people argue about one side or the other.
Yeah, now the conversation's shifting to, all right, well, what week is Fields going to take over? And it's going to be exhausting. I was kind of hoping that this conversation would stop, but of course, it is not going to. I think it's going to persist pretty much the whole season unless Russell Wilson puts an exclamation point on, say the first 2, 3, 4, 5 games of the season. Then maybe it'll calm down. But the second Russell Wilson struggles, it's going to be a conversation again. So, we're all prepared for that to happen, I think, at this point. But and some interesting comments by Tomlin. He was on the Rich Eisen show. One of the best interviews I think I've seen in a while. Eisen absolutely killed it. Tomlin was, joking around. He was much more open. He wasn't dismissing questions as he does with the local Pittsburgh media a lot of the times. And I think he had a lot of good things to say in that interview. If you guys haven't seen it, definitely go look that up. I'm sure it's on YouTube somewhere. But I think he said Eisen asked him, is Fields going to be in packages? And Tomlin's like, we're not going to reveal too much of our strategy, et cetera, et cetera. But he did say Raheem Morris, his good friend dating back years in coaching jobs of the past, he said Raheem Morris better be ready. And so that was kind of interesting to me. Joe, do you think would Tomlin say that? I mean, it's just kind of a weird thing. I think I saw some talk show discussing that this morning in terms of, is that some reverse psychology? Is there a plan to actually use Fields like significantly in some kind of package? Like, is it just at the point where everybody sees it coming, so why try to hide it? Where do you come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit of gamesmanship. Chris Hoke speculated after the game that one of the reasons they were delaying naming a starter was to keep Atlanta from practicing some of the read option, QB power, the QB design run stuff that they do with Fields. And I think by telling them that, like, hey, we're going to do it, then you're keeping Atlanta practicing it. And I mean, if the Steelers can choose to do it, they can choose not to do it. I mean, I think they will. I think it's been reported pretty much this offseason that, Diana Rossini said that I think it was on the first episode of Scoop City that, it's in the playbook that there's packages for Fields. Jeremy Fowler had reported that the teams expect the Steelers to use Fields in short area, red zone with, QB read option, stuff like that. And we saw that against Detroit. He got him down the goal line, then Michael Piron punched it in. So I wouldn't be surprised if they opted to, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 snaps with Fields in, short area situations, maybe close to the red zone. I could see him getting a bunch of rushing touchdowns this season. You letting him use his speed out in the open down by the red zone. So I wouldn't be surprised if they did. I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't, but I think at this point I kind of expected that we'll at least see, a few plays and see how it works. And I'm kind of intrigued and I'm excited to see how it kind of operates, because I think it could actually be, a really successful addition to the Steelers offense this year.
Yeah, you just want to avoid the situation where, Fields comes in the game and everybody knows, like, all right, they have 3 plays that they're going to run with Fields. So, and I think Arthur Smith does a good job in general with having a much more open playbook than the Steelers have had in the past few years here. But, yeah, I think that it'll be very interesting to see how all of that plays out. Mike Tomlin specifically said that Justin Fields is too talented, basically, to sit around on the bench. And so I think we will see some of these packages. It's just a matter of how much, is it going to affect? I know, and Russell Wilson actually endorsed these kinds of packages at some point in the offseason. He said, he was, happy with whatever's going to make the offense score points, and he acknowledged that Fields has a certain skill set about him. And so as long as Wilson isn't getting upset with it, I know some quarterbacks don't like being taken out of the game and taken out of rhythm. And, Russell Wilson, one of his best traits is kind of his operation in the red zone. So are you really going to take him out in that area, put in Justin Fields, who has ball security issues and et cetera, et cetera? And if Fields gets in the game and fumbles, is that going to be a wrap on the package experiment? I think all of these things are going to answer themselves as the season progresses. But I think that might be all that we have for the show today. Joe, did you have anything else on that topic that you wanted to touch on? Nope. All right. Well, we don't have any questions to answer today, so please do give us a call at 412-254-3145. Again, that's 412-254-3145. It's just a voicemail box. No one's going to pick up. Just leave us a question, and we will answer it on a future episode. Let us know where you're from. We'd love to know where our listeners are tuning in from. Let us know your name. We've had a couple of repeat callers, and we want to get to know some of you guys as well. And that is all for today. We will catch you guys next week.